Welcome, everyone. It sounds like we have a lot of morning people in the room. We're trying to get the program underway, so if we could lower our voices. Welcome, everyone. It's an honor to have you here today at the Annual Fundraising Breakfast for the Mental Health Foundation. We are so excited to have you join us in person and online. A very special welcome to our virtual guests and virtual host, Lourdes Johann, who is tuning in from cyberspace, and we have attendees from all across Canada, which is very exciting. As well, a big thank you to everyone here in the room for attending and giving back to such an important cause. We're thrilled to have everyone here this morning for the Mental Health Foundation's annual fundraising breakfast. My name is Simone Saunders, and I am so excited to be your host for the 2023 Mental Health Foundation Breakfast presented by Altitude Investments Group of Companies. I'm the founder of the Cognitive Corner, which is a group psychological practice focused on trauma-informed and culturally responsive mental health care. We practice in person in Calgary and virtually in multiple provinces, and I also provide psychoeducation on both Instagram and TikTok to aid in the destigmatization of mental health. On behalf of the Mental Health Foundation, we acknowledge that what we call Alberta is a traditional and ancestral territory of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who for generations lived on and cared for these lands. Our work takes place on historical and contemporary Indigenous lands, including the territories of Treaty 6, 7, and 8, and a portion of the Métis homeland, including regions 1 through 6. I make this statement as a small act of reconciliation, respect, and gratitude to those on whose territories and land we reside. So, what can you expect from today? First, we'll be hearing from our presenting sponsor, Altitude Investments. Next, you'll hear more about why naloxone is a life-saving measure in the opioid crisis. And then you'll hear from our keynote speaker, Johann. To close the breakfast, Deborah McKinnon, President and CEO of the Mental Health Foundation, will wrap things up. I am honored to be gathered with you all today, in person and virtually, for the Mental Health Foundation Annual Breakfast. As our largest fundraising event, this is a critical opportunity to raise funds and awareness to support the work that we do to connect our community to the importance of mental health. Let's take a few moments to get to know about the Mental Health Foundation.
Basically, they saved my life. People think that saving lives only happens with things like heart attacks or trauma accidents from car accidents and things like that. But sometimes it's our brains.
No one is really alone. We're all going through this together, and there are places that are meant for you to use for your health and well-being.
Speaking up as a person with so many different intersecting marginalized identities, I'm hoping to become a role model for folks who might be struggling with their mental health but aren't already immediately involved in seeking help.
I get gratitude out of this, and I think I can say that I'm a witness to this human resolve and human spirit. It's incredible.
You don't always associate a hospital with being this sort of fresh air, therapeutic space where, patients can get out and enjoy long walks. They can enjoy fresh air. They can play sports out here. It's the number of resources and opportunities is amazing.
We're talking about it, and we're willing to support each other. We're willing to take those conversations that we wouldn't have had before into a public setting or talk to colleagues that we may not have shared at that level before with. And so that's where I think the hope begins. And then that will draw attention to the way we invest in our healthcare system.
By incorporating diversity and equity into mental health advocacy, including what we do at Kickstand, it's really sending a message that everybody is welcome.
The idea is to work ourselves out of a job. Like, if we could make everyone well, that's our goal.
Community, togetherness, and support. All of these are key elements in the treatment of addictions and mental health. No one person or organization should or can tackle this alone. By coming together, we can support one another, we can learn together and from each other, and we can fight the stigma that often comes with mental health issues so that no one suffers in silence. 50% of the population will have a mental illness by age 40. 1 in 6 Albertans seriously think about suicide each year. 70% of mental health problems and illnesses have their onset during adolescence. And 21% of Canadians will experience an addiction in their lifetime. The reality can be hard to imagine, and that's where you come in. Support from folks like you goes a long way in helping us to deliver mental health services, resources, tools, and initiatives. Your very attendance helps us in so many ways, and so we're so grateful that you chose to spend time with us this morning. You will have a few opportunities to support the foundation today. One of the ways that you can do that is by purchasing 50/50 tickets, and we know how much Albertans love their 50/50 raffles. The jackpot is currently sitting at over $3,000, so let's see how much we can grow that before the end of the program. There's a QR code in your program and on the screen right now that will take you directly to the site to purchase. So yes, I'm officially giving you permission to pull out your phones. While you're at it, if you haven't already, we encourage you to take some photos and share them on social media, and be sure to tag Mental Health AB and use hashtag Mental Health AB. Before we jump further into the program, let's take a moment to recognize and thank our sponsors for their generous support. These sponsors have been integral in allowing us to make this event happen. They have provided us with the resources and support we need to host this breakfast and to continue the mission of providing mental health services for all. We can't thank them enough for their contribution and commitment to our cause. A huge thank you to our silver sponsors, Asif Law Personal Injury, Claystone Waste Ltd, Flamin Group of Companies, Ledcor Group, and Trimac Transportation. We're so grateful for the support of our gold in-kind sponsors, Bell Media and Chorus Entertainment. And last, but certainly not least, our presenting sponsor, Altitude Investment Group of Companies, including Local Environmental, We Know Training, and Y Station. Thank you for your immeasurable support, both as a multi-year sponsor of the breakfast and as a dedicated partner of the Mental Health Foundation. With that, I'd like to welcome Chris and Lisa Labossiere from Altitude Investments up to the stage.
Thank you, and good morning. All the talk of anxiety, and it doesn't help to have to know you've got to get up at about 5 in the morning and eventually speak to 1,000 people. So we were feeling our own. I just want to bring our thanks and introduce the Altitude Group of Companies. It's not just a collection of logos; it's a collection of amazing people. Our family is here. Our daughters, Lauren and Hannah, and son-in-laws, Colton and Tyler, and our 2 new grandsons, Jack and August, Gus, are here this morning, so we're excited about that, but also our work families, so the people that we work with. I'd like to recognize Sue Broderick from Altitude Investments, who's helped us do something special this morning that we're excited to announce, and my very good friend and business partner, Marty Van Sloan, who works with me at Local. We're all affected by mental health, mental wellness, and mental illness. It's apparent. I think the pandemic made it an issue that we both felt. It strongly raised awareness of it in our families, in ourselves, and in our companies, and obviously in our communities. But the pandemic left largely, collective stress and anxiety, and frankly, some mental challenges that many of us face didn't leave. And I'm really excited to hear from Johann today, who I just finished his book, and it's like, what the hell is happening? And then I read the book, and it became obvious there's so much happening to us all the time. So on behalf of Lisa and I and Altitude, I want to say thanks. We did something special, Deborah. We had lunch with Deborah about a month ago and tried to ask how we can really help as not just donors, financial donors, but as sponsors of this organization. We got together as a group, our work family group and our family, and we decided we wanted to find enough people who would help us underwrite the cost of this entire event, both the virtual and the physical event you're at today. So I'd like to recognize, there is a graphic that shows underwriters, sponsors. We went on to a week-long vacation in Mexico, and Lisa knows I don't do well sitting by the pool, so I spent most of the week texting people, very cheeky text messages, people that I know that have the ability to give, and I'm very thankful that we found almost 30 people and Alberta companies and Albertans that committed over $5,000 or $5,000 each to cover the entire cost of this event. So I'd like to thank them and recognize them as well today. You'll see them up here, and we'll share more. So that gives you permission, I guess. Our ask of you today is everything is paid for here today now. Every dollar you give is going to go directly to mental health programs. So please do. So thank you very much. Enjoy your breakfast.
Thank you very much, Chris, and Altitude Investments and the underwriters for your ongoing support for this event. That is incredible. Next, joining us to deliver an important presentation on naloxone will be Dr. Jessica Kirkwood. The opioid crisis is growing at a steady rate all across Canada. Did you know? Alberta has the third highest rate of opioid poisonings per capita in the country. From 2016 to 2021, opioid poisonings more than doubled for a total of more than 1,600 deaths in 2021. Every day in Alberta, nearly 5 people die of opioid poisoning. Naloxone is a medication designed to reverse the effects of opioid poisoning, making it a vital tool in the fight against opioid crisis. This presentation is especially timely and important for us as the Mental Health Foundation is equally committed to providing care for addictions and mental health issues. Dr. Kirkwood is a highly respected doctor and researcher in the field of addiction and mental health. She understands the serious but often overlooked connections between mental health and addiction and has dedicated her career to helping people gain access to the treatment that they need. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jessica Kirkwood.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Simone, and thank you so much to the Mental Health Foundation for giving me the opportunity to speak to you about something that's really important to me, and hopefully you too in 5 minutes. If you're not aware, this is what a naloxone kit looks like. We've got a whole pile of them at the back with amazing colleagues that I've worked with in the past. And if you don't carry one of these, you should start, and I'll tell you why. Naloxone is an incredibly effective medication at immediately reversing the effects of an opioid. And the reason that's important is because opioids, when taken in amounts that are uncertain and fatal, as so many Albertans and Canadians and humans have experienced through this opioid poisoning crisis, can cause you to get really, really sleepy and not be able to wake up. And they also decrease your brain's drive to breathe. And those two things combined have been fatal for so many people. In the past 2 years, approximately 10 to 15% of my patient panel has died because of an opioid poisoning. It never gets easier, and I hope it never does. I hope I choke up every time I think about that, because we hear these numbers. Those numbers were people that I knew very, very well, that I knew better than most of my first degree family members, and that I love deeply. So I think about when I'm preparing to talk to you about how to administer naloxone, which I won't give you the whole spiel. My colleagues in the back will. There's also 2 virtual options for you to learn how you can confidently provide this life-saving medication. But I think about the first time I was a practicing doctor. It was about 10 years ago, and my now grade 3-year-old daughter was growing safely in my womb. And I responded to an opioid poisoning, but I didn't know that's what it was. It was just a lady who looked very unwell and wouldn't respond to the stimuli we provided. And so we started CPR because that's what we did at the time. Now our process has changed quite dramatically. I was also one of the first responders, and that process has also changed dramatically because that poisoning that happened was one that happened couple times a year, maybe, at best. And now I'm going to leave here and go to work down the street, and it will happen maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe 15 times today. I may not hear about any of those episodes because my incredibly skilled colleagues, my MOAs, my client support workers, my nurses, and the people that are providing care on the street that are also my patients, they will respond to these poisonings within the 1-block radius of my clinic. 9, 10 years ago, when I responded, unfortunately, that person did not receive naloxone fast enough, and she did not survive that event. I can say that that is the only poisoning that I have participated in and that has happened on our property that has resulted in a death because of this medication. So I just want to dispel quickly a few myths. One is that you require my level of training to provide this. You absolutely do not. And with really simple training, you can also provide this life-saving medication to patients. One is that something really bad will happen if you take this or you give this to someone that is not having an opioid poisoning at the time, and that is absolutely not true. The only thing this medication does is reverses the effects of an opioid. And I have this dream that one day I'm gonna drop naloxone on a stage like this and I'm gonna stab it into my thigh to show everyone that nothing will happen to me. But I am far more scared of speaking to all of you than I am of, potentially having to drop a medication later, so my hands are far shakier now than they will be for the rest of the day. One day, I'll do that. It'll be super cool and impactful. And the last myth I'd want to dispel is that giving these kits to people causes them to have riskier behaviors, use more drugs, or use drugs in a higher amount. And there are studies that have shown that that is not true. In New York City, Dr. Jeremiah Jones took active heroin users and past heroin users and treated them by teaching them about these kits, and then followed up and said, like, how much you using now? How much you using now? And they were using less. And who knows, there's lots of reasons why that could be, but they certainly weren't using more, because none of my patients are trying to walk the line of life and death. They're trying to survive. And if we have these kits available to everybody, we can help them do that for at least one more day. Last thing I'll say is, in this wonderful career that I'm privileged to be a part of, I've got to teach a lot. And at the end of my talks, when I speak about the work I do and how much I love the work I do, I share a slide that's called Dr. K's Faves. And I talk about organizations like Mom Stop the Harm. If you're in the room, thank you for the work you do. I talk about Aware. If you're in the room, thank you for the work that you do. I talked about the film Kamami Pitson, The Meaning of Empathy, which was filmed in Alberta, which is a beautiful film. And I talk about the book Chasing the Scream. So thank you for this opportunity to get to witness my favorite author speak about something that I'm so passionate about. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Dr. Kirkwood, for that important presentation. This is an important topic, and the work that you're doing is incredible. One of the things that stood out to me about what she said is that every single one of those statistics is a person, and I think that we often forget that when we hear all of these large numbers. So I want us to remember that going forward. A reminder to all of our guests that you can pick up your free naloxone kit from the StreetWorks table on the far side of the room near the main doors, and you can also sign up for one of the free virtual training sessions being presented by StreetWorks. This goes for our virtual guests too. This is happening on March 28th and April 20th. We'll pop a registration link in the chat for virtual guests, and for those in-person guests, there's a QR code on the screen and at the registration table for sign up. Now, let me please take a minute to introduce you to our keynote speaker for today's event. Johann is an inspiration for many. He has dedicated much of his life to tackling mental health and addiction issues, drawing both on evidence-based science and personal stories. His writing does not shy away from difficult topics, but instead seeks to bring hope, understanding, and healing to those affected by mental health and addiction issues. He speaks openly about his struggles with depression and addiction, aiming to show that anyone can find their way out of the darkness. Johann's work has been praised for its compassion and insight into complex topics, as well as its ability to spark meaningful conversations on how we can create a better society for everyone. By combining science with storytelling, he shines a light on the importance of caring for our mental health in order for us to live our best lives. His commitment to making the world a better place is truly inspiring, and we owe it to ourselves and each other to take his message of hope seriously. Twice named Journalist of the Year by Amnesty International, Johann Hari is the author of 3 New York Times best-selling books, including Chasing the Scream and Lost Connections. His most recent work, Stolen Focused, was also named Amazon's #1 nonfiction book of the year. Johann has spent his life writing about society's biggest issues and has contributed to publications all over the world, including the New York Times, The Guardian, and the Politico. His TED Talk has over 20 million views, which is almost half the population of Canada. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Johann Hari.
Thanks so much. Cheers. I'll embrace this. Hi, thank you. Cheers. Hey, everyone. I feel a little bit self-conscious about something. I should just level about it. They made me wear, the very nice tech guys at the back made me wear this kind of microphone. And I have this slightly weird thing that happens to me when I do this, where the first time I ever wore one of these microphones was when I gave a TED Talk a few years ago. And as the guy put it on my head, I said to him, if you make me wear this, I'm going to feel like Madonna. And he looked at me really intensely and he said, you should always feel like Madonna. So now whenever I wear one of these, whatever I'm meant to be talking about, I just feel this very strong urge to randomly sing Papa Don't Preach. It doesn't work out. I also feel self-conscious about something else. I'm not sure if you can, I'm not sure if they did it, but they had a photograph up there, my kind of publicity photo, which is from like 3 years ago, so it's my pre-COVID weight. And the other day I had to give a speech where they put that photo was there the whole time I was speaking, and I started to feel like a Weight Watchers ad where I was like the before, and you could see the after. I'm also very impressed that you're all here. I think the biggest division between human beings is not like liberals versus conservatives or atheists versus religious people. It's morning people versus everyone else. So I'm very suspicious of all of you for being so coherent this early in the morning. I would be injected with caffeine directly into my veins if it was allowed. So I want to talk to you. I'm really excited to be here because I really admire the work the Mental Health Foundation does. And I want to talk to you about why it's so important. So you don't need me to tell you this. We're meeting in the middle of a massive and unprecedented crisis. Addiction is now at the highest level in the history of North America. 20 Canadians die every day of overdoses. In this province alone, 7,000 Albertans have died of overdoses since 2016. To give you a sense of the scale of that, that's the equivalent of almost 3 9/11s of people dying of overdoses. And one of the main things I want you all to know is that is preventable. That does not have to happen. You do not have to accept that. I have been to places that had crises as big as this and turned it around and brought their death rates down to almost zero. And I want to talk to you about how you can do it. And it requires us to really profoundly shift the way we think about these problems. And for me, this is a very personal question. One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to, and I was too small then to understand why. But as I got older, I realized we had addiction in my family. Several members of my family still do. And like a lot of people in that position, I was a real mixture of emotions, right? I felt a tremendous amount of love for the people in my family. I also felt incredibly angry. I was like, why doesn't someone just stop you? Why can't you stop yourself? So it's this real mixture. And I started researching this subject 12 years ago because of that mixture of feelings, because I felt like nothing I was doing was making any difference. Neither the compassionate bit of me nor the angry bit of me seemed to be making much difference. So I ended up going on this really big journey all over the world. I ended up traveling over 30,000 miles. I went to places that have the most compassionate policies on addiction, the harshest policies on addiction and mental health. And I got to know a crazy mixture of people, from a trans crack dealer in Brooklyn who turned out to be one of the wisest people I've ever met, to a hitman for the deadliest Mexican drug cartel. He's definitely not one of the wisest people I've ever met. And I learned a huge amount about this. And the core of what I learned is that so much of what we think about this subject, so much of what I thought about this subject is wrong. Drugs are not what we think they are. Addiction is not what we think it is. The war on drugs is not what we think it is. And crucially, the alternatives to the war on drugs are not what we think they are. So I want to start with a story about a person who probably everyone here in this room has heard of, that I think has a lot to tell us. And for a minute, you're going to think, why is he telling me this story? What has this got to do with the war on drugs? Just bear with me, because I think it's a crucial part of how we think about, reframing how we think about addiction. So in 1939, in the summer of 1939, in a hotel in Midtown Manhattan, the great jazz singer Billie Holiday walked onto a stage, and she sang a song. They didn't let her go through the front door of the hotel because she was black. They made her go through the service elevator, but they let her sing in front of a white audience. And she sang a song called Strange Fruit, which a lot of you probably know. It's based on the idea that there's a strange fruit in the Deep South, and as you're listening to the song, you realize the fruit is the bodies of black men who've been murdered by white mobs, lynched. Billie Holiday sang this song. She'd been singing it for a little while. And that night, after she came off stage, she got a warning from the agents of something called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And they said to her, stop singing this song. Now that might seem like an odd moment to begin talking about the question of addiction. What's that got to do with addiction? If you understand what happened to Billie Holiday before, during, and after that moment, you understand a huge amount about what you're getting wrong here in Alberta at the moment, I think, and what we can start to put right. So Billie Holiday got that warning from the agents of a man named Harry Anslinger. Harry Anslinger was a government bureaucrat, and he ran the Department of Alcohol Prohibition. He took it over just as alcohol prohibition was ending. So he had this big government department that was about to have nothing to do. And to keep his department going, he invented the modern war on drugs. He's the first person to ever use the phrase war on drugs, way before Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan or the people we normally think about it. And he built the war on drugs around things he sincerely believed. It wasn't totally cynical. And it was really based on an intense hatred of two groups. The first was a really deep hatred of black people, Latinos, Chinese Americans. I mean, he was so racist that he was regarded as an extreme racist in the 1920s, which gives you an idea of how bad he was, right? He used the N-word so often in official memos, his own senator said he should have to resign. So he hated black people. And he really hated people with addiction problems. He'd grown up in a town called Altoona, and on the farm he grew up on, the next farm down, the farmer's wife had been addicted to opium, and it had terrified him. And he became obsessed with the idea that addiction was this menace that had to be stamped out. So to him, Billie Holiday was the symbol of everything he hated. She was a black woman standing up against racism, and Billie Holiday had an addiction problem, and we know why. Billie Holiday grew up in the poorest part of Baltimore. It was a place called Pigtown. And when she was 11 years old, a man named Wilbur Rich came to get her. He was 42. He came to get her. He said, I've been sent by your mother to come and get you. You've got to come with me. So she went with him, and he violently raped her. Wilbur Rich was punished for what he did. He was sent to prison for 1.5 years. Billie Holiday was punished much worse. She was told, these were the words they used, obviously not my words, that she was a whore, that it was her fault that she led this man on. They sent her to a convent where the nuns said they were going to teach her a lesson. And even at the age of 11, Billie Holiday was a very resilient person. They said, I didn't do anything wrong. So they punished her in escalating ways. They would lock her in a... because they handled dead bodies, because it was also a funeral parlor. They would lock her in with the dead bodies overnight, really hatefully cruel things. And Billie Holiday ran away, very wisely. And she decided to actually find her mother. Her mother was working in a brothel in Harlem at the time. So she ran away to find her mother. And she found her mom, and very quickly she started working, I'm putting working in inverted commas, alongside her mother. So she was being prostituted as a child. So she's being raped by strangers day after day after day after day. And when she was 15, the brothel was raided by the cops. They didn't help her. They sent her to prison. Again, they used the language that they used about her, that she was a whore, that it was her fault. So she'd been a child prostitute, and they punished her even more. To deal with the pain of that, Billie Holiday sought out anesthetics, right? Initially a lot of alcohol and then heroin. And she took a lot of these anesthetics to deal with the pain. At the same time, She also became one of the greatest geniuses of the 20th century. She reinvented singing. People as different as Frank Sinatra and Jay-Z have said that she transformed how they do their music, right? Singing behind the beat, all of those things. She sang these incredible songs. So when Harry Anslinger and his agent say to her, stop singing this song, she said, in effect, she swore a lot, so I won't use the word she used, but she said, screw you, I'm an American citizen, I'll do what I damn well please. And at that point, Anslinger's agents, and Anslinger specifically, resolved to destroy her. So Harry Anslinger hated employing black people, but you couldn't really employ a white agent to follow Billie Holiday everywhere and document her use. Kind of a white guy in Harlem would have stood out at that time. So that he employed a black agent called Jimmy Fletcher. And he said to Jimmy Fletcher, follow Billie Holiday everywhere she goes. Document her drug use. We're going to break her. We're going to break all the jazz musicians. Go after her. So Jimmy Fletcher followed her around for a year and a half. And it's pretty clear when you read the transcript of the surviving interview with him that Jimmy Fletcher, Billie Holiday was so amazing that Jimmy Fletcher fell in love with her. And his whole life he felt really ashamed of what he did next. He arrested her. She was imprisoned. She was put on trial. The trial was called the United States versus Billie Holiday. She said that's how it damn well felt. They sent her to prison for 18 months. She did not sing a word in prison. But the cruelest thing is what happened next. When she got out, so anywhere where you, almost anywhere in the United States where you wanted to perform in front of an audience where alcohol was served, you needed to have something called a cabaret performer's license. And Anslinger's men made sure that Billie Holiday did not get a cabaret performer's license, right? One of her goddaughters, Lorraine Feather, said to me, what's the cruelest thing you can do to a person? Is to take away the thing they love, right? Imagine taking away singing from Billie Holiday. That, by the way, is what we do to people with addiction problems all over Canada, all in most of the world right now. Instead of helping them reconnect, we give them criminal records, we put barriers between them and reconnecting. In that situation, with all that trauma and cut off from being able to express her genius in full, Billie Holiday entirely predictably relapsed. And not long after, she collapsed in Midtown, not far from where she'd sung Strange Fruit that night. And the first hospital, they wouldn't let her in because she had an addiction problem. They turned her away. The second hospital let her in. But Billie said to her friend Maylie Dufty on the way in that Anslinger's men weren't finished with her. She said, they're going to kill me in there. Don't let them. They're going to kill me in there. She wasn't wrong. So in the hospital, she was diagnosed with very advanced liver cancer. And they wouldn't give her any methadone in the prison, so she started to go into withdrawal, which is very dangerous if you're weak with cancer. And her friend Maylie managed to absolutely insist that they gave her methadone. She started to rally a bit. But they arrested her on her hospital bed. They handcuffed her to her hospital bed. I interviewed the last person who'd been in that room, amazing man named the Reverend Eugene Callender. They wouldn't let her friends in to see her. They wouldn't let her have a record player. And then they cut off her methadone, and the next day she died. One of her friends said she looked like she had been violently wrenched from life. While she was dying, there were people outside the hospital protesting with signs saying that they were killing her, that these drug policies were killing her. They had signs saying, "Let Lady Day live." That was her stage name. And I think when we think about this story about Billie Holiday, it tells us a lot about what we need to think about now. Because that conflict between Harry Anslinger and Billie Holiday is not over. Harry Anslinger invented the drug policies that are enforced in this province. They were imposed on the whole world following what he did. And we follow that script, a script predominantly based, and of course there's important pushback to this, really important pushback in your state, in your province. But we follow a script that says, shame people, punish them, there's something wrong with them. And when you think about Billie Holiday's story, think about how many times that story could have gone differently. When she was 11 years old, the money that was spent on punishing people with addiction problems could have been spent on giving her love and support and help and explain to her it wasn't her fault she'd been raped. When the police raid the brothel and she's 15, all that money that was spent on imprisoning and shaming people with addiction problems could have been spent on helping her turn her lives around. At every stage, when she was on trial, she said, I just want someone to help me. I don't want to be addicted. All that money that was spent on shaming and imprisoning her could have been spent on helping her and giving her love And I think most of us suspect her story would have ended very differently, and the evidence suggests from places that have changed to this different approach that she would have been far more likely to live and to survive. But, you know, the core of that story for me is before you talk about any of the questions about, okay, what do we do to save the lives of people with addiction problems, you need to start with a much more basic question. Do we want them to live? Do we want them to survive? Do we think their lives are worth living? Because the truth is, most people at that time looked at people like Billie Holiday and thought, no, it doesn't matter. If she dies, she dies. Some of them even thought, like Harry Anslinger, thought it was better if she died. When not long after she died, he wrote down, there'll be no more good morning heartache for her, he boasted, right? So before we talk about any of the other stuff, you've got to make a moral decision. Did Billie Holiday matter? Does every person with an addiction problem matter? Are they people like us? Do they have addictions because they're suffering and they're in pain? If that's the case, then, but if we don't make that choice right at the start, none of the rest of the stuff follows, right? You know, and for me, this was, I don't know if challenging is the right word, but it really transformed my own thinking, obviously getting to know lots of people who'd known Billie Holiday. You know, I went to interview a woman called Yolanda Bavan, a great jazz musician, who Billie had called her daughter. She was 18 when Billie died. And I said to her, this was maybe 2013, I said to her, what would you say to Billie Holiday if you could speak to her now? And she said, she'd been telling me how Billie Holiday thought she'd be completely forgotten, that they weren't just killing her, they were wiping out the memory of her. And she said, I'd say to her, Billie, this morning I went to Whole Foods and they were playing your songs. Nobody forgot you, baby. And I think we need to not, obviously no one's going to forget the genius of Billie Holiday, but we need to remember the core of this, right? And to me that was so important because anyone who loves someone who's got an addiction problem, you're angry. There's a little bit of Harry Anslinger in all of us, right? It's not an unnatural part of the debate, although you don't want it to drive public policy. But what Billie Holiday's story taught me is, you know, in our culture, we tell one heroic story about people with addiction problems, which is sometimes they recover from their addictions. Often they recover. And that is indeed a heroic story, and it is really important. And everyone in this room who's in that position should be incredibly proud of themselves. But that is not the only heroic story about addiction. Billie Holiday never recovered from addiction. She died with her addiction. She was still an unbelievable hero. She was still one of the great artistic geniuses of the 20th century and one of the bravest people of the 20th century. Confronted with this machinery determined to destroy people like her, she stood up. She refused to let it be done to her as much as she could. And I think that lesson is really important for us as well, in terms of how we think about this crisis, what we do about it. Because all over the world, people are still following the script written by Harry Anslinger, and it makes them weaker and it breaks them more. But all over the world, people listen to Billie Holiday, and it makes them stronger. And I think we need to think about that strength as we go forward. So, as we think about what we want to do now, I think we need to think about lots of things that will help in reframing this problem in ways that will save the lives of people here in Alberta. One of them is a breakthrough that happened in Canada that has transformed how people think about addiction all over the world. And it's certainly transformed my own life. So if you'd asked me when I started researching this 12 years ago, let's talk about heroin addiction because that was close to me. If you'd said to me, Johann, what causes heroin addiction? I would have looked at you like you were an idiot, and I would have said, well, the clue's in the name. Obviously, heroin causes heroin addiction. We've been told a story for 100 years that's become totally part of our common sense. It was certainly part of mine. So we think if we kidnap the next 20 people to walk past this building, and like a villain in a horror movie, we injected them with heroin, 3 times a day for a month, and then let them go, at the end of that month, they'd all be addicted to heroin for a simple reason. There's chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would start to desperately physically crave. And at the end of that month, they'd have this tremendous physical hunger for the drug, right? This is why in English, another word for being addicted is being hooked. We think addiction is driven primarily by the chemical hooks. It turns out chemical hooks are definitely real, but the evidence shows they're a very small part of what's happening with addiction. And I want to explain why. So I first began to learn this when it kept being explained to me by doctors in Britain, where I'm from, as you can tell from my weird Downton Abbey accent. The doctors kept explaining to me, if any of you come to London and anywhere in Britain, and you get hit by a truck and you break your hip, you'll be taken to hospital and you'll be given a lot of a drug called diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's medically pure heroin. It's much better than anything you could score on the streets. It's the good stuff, right? And people in British hospitals who have hip problems or are given diamorphine for quite long periods of time. If any of you have a British grandma who's had a hip replacement operation, your grandma has taken a lot of heroin, right? Now, if what we think about addiction is right, that it's caused primarily or entirely by exposure to the chemical hooks, what should be happening to all these people being given really powerful heroin in British hospitals? Some of them should be leaving and trying to score on the streets. There's been loads of medical research into this. It doesn't happen. And I remember thinking, well, how can that be true? It doesn't fit with what we've been told about the opioid crisis. It doesn't seem to fit with anything, right? How could you have a situation where you've got someone in a hospital bed, they're being given loads of really medically pure heroin, they don't become addicted, and you've got someone in the alleyway outside shooting up a much, actually milder form of the drug, and they do become addicted? It didn't make any sense to me. And I only began to understand it when I went to the downtown east side in Vancouver and interviewed a great Canadian named Professor Bruce Alexander. And he explained to me, this story we have in our heads about addiction, that it's driven totally or mostly by the chemical hooks, comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. You can all try these experiments at home if you're feeling a little bit sadistic. You take a rat, you put it in a cage. You shouldn't do this at home. You take a rat, you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat tries both. It always prefers the drug water, and it almost always kills itself quite quickly within a week or 2. So there you go, right? That's our story. The rat tries the drug, wants more and more of it, and it needs so much it eventually overdoses. But in the 70s, Professor Alexander came along and said, well, hang on a minute. You put the rat alone in an empty cage where it's got nothing that makes life worth living for rats. What would happen if we did this differently? So he built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats, right? They got loads of friends, they got loads of cheese, they got loads of colored balls, they can have loads of sex. Anything a rat could want in life, anything they find meaningful is there in Rat Park. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drug water. And of course they try both. This is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drug water. They hardly ever use it. None of them use it compulsively. None of them overdose. So you go from almost 100% compulsive use and overdose when they do not have the things that make life worth living for them, to no compulsive use and overdose when they do have the things that make life worth living for them. That's why I realized the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. Hugely valuable though that is to many people. The opposite of addiction is connection. The core of addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life because your life is too painful a place to be. And when you understand that, you can see why this approach that we're following, which comes from Harry Anslinger, of shame and punishment, is such a disaster, right? So our theory, the theory of that is, well, people with addiction problems are indulging themselves, and you need to punish them to give them an incentive to stop. But once you understand that pain is the driver of addiction, pain is the cause of addiction, you can see why that, sometimes we say it doesn't work. The truth is much worse. It makes the problem worse, right? It makes the problem worse. So, of course, this forces us to reframe the opioid crisis as well. We've been told that the opioid crisis is driven that people got accidentally hooked and so on, and chemical hooks play some small role. But the truth is, where is the opioid crisis worst? Think about the United States. Every single person on the faculty at Harvard could go and get opioids tomorrow because they've got doctors who trust them, they've got really good medical insurance, and and they could easily get them. But there's almost no addiction on the faculty at Harvard. Where is the addiction worse? Places like Monadnock in New Hampshire, where I spent time, the epicenter of the opioid crisis, where actually most people don't have medical insurance, and most people find it much harder to get the drug. Their doctors don't trust them. They're much more suspicious. And yet they have extremely high levels of addiction. It's not ease of access that determines where the addiction crisis is. In fact, places where the addiction crisis is are places where access is harder to legal opioids. What's driving it then? Why is it happening? It's happening, the best studies of this by people like Professor Angus Dayton and Professor Ann Case, who called them deaths of despair. Opioid deaths are highest where all the indicators of despair that are not to do with opioids are highest. Suicide, antidepressant use, across the board, right? You don't have to spend. So these are symptoms. All addiction is an attempt to solve a problem. It's not a good solution, obviously. There's reasons so obvious I don't need to say them. It's not a good solution, but it's an attempt to solve a problem. We need to both obviously deal with the symptom, but we also need to deal with the underlying cause. And I went to places that have done that. Places that rebuilt their drug policies around the insights that come from Rat Park. So I'll give you an example of one, which I think is really important for thinking about in relation to what you do next. If we decide that we want people to live and we decide that we value their lives. So in the year 2000, Portugal had a crisis even worse than the one that's happening in Alberta when it comes to addiction. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is staggering. And every year they tried the Harry Anslinger American script more and more. They arrested more people, they shamed more people, they imprisoned more people. And every year the problem got worse. Until finally, the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and they were like, look, we can't go on like this. With ever more people being addicted to heroin, what are we going to do? So they decided to do something really radical, something nobody had done for 70 years since Harry Anslinger. They said, should we ask some scientists what to do? So they set up a panel of scientists and doctors led by an amazing man I got to know named Dr. João Goulão. And they said to them, you guys go away. The panel was social workers, scientists, and a judge. And they said to them, you guys go away, figure out what would genuinely solve this problem, and we've agreed in advance we'll do whatever you recommend. So it just took it out of politics. And they got all the political parties to agree, all the main ones. So the panel goes away, and they look at all the evidence, the science. They look at Rat Park, loads of other things. And they came back, and they said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to decriminalize all drugs, from cannabis to crack, the whole lot. But, and this is the crucial next step, one that, by the way, is missing from the decriminalization plans in Canada at the moment, in BC, really important next step, we're going to take all the money we currently spend on shaming people, arresting them, punishing them, imprisoning them, trying them, all that fortune, we're going to spend it instead on turning their lives around. And interestingly, it's not really what we think of as drug treatment in Canada and North America and Britain. So they do some residential rehab, that has value, but the biggest thing they did was a huge program of reconnection for people with addiction problems. Let's say you used to be a mechanic. They'll go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. It was programs getting people back into work. It was getting people housing, because no one is going to recover from an addiction when they're on the streets. It was a big problem of dealing with these underlying drivers of despair. The goal was to say to every single person with an addiction problem in Portugal, we love you, we value you, we're on your side, we want you back. So by the time I first went to Portugal, it was 13 years since this experiment had begun, and the best research on this by the British Journal of Criminology found that addiction had more than halved. Overdose deaths were down by 80%, 80%. HIV transmission was down by 90%. And one of the ways you know it works so well is Portugal has a very competitive political system, 5 main parties. None of them want to go back. Not even the far-right party wants to go back to the criminalization. I went to interview one of the leading when I was in Portugal, one of the ways you know it works so well is I went to interview the guy who led the opposition to the decriminalization at the time that they were doing it, a guy called João Figueira. He was the top drug cop in Portugal then and when I went to interview him. And at the time, he said what lots of people very understandably say when they hear the idea of decriminalizing all drugs and using the money to actually help people. He said, this is madness. We're going to have an explosion in drug use. We'll have an explosion in children using drugs. We cannot do this. He campaigned very vigorously against it. And when I went to see him 13 years on, he said to me, everything I said would happen didn't happen. And everything the other side said would happen did. And he said he felt really ashamed that he'd spent so many years screwing people's lives up when he could have been helping them turn their lives around, when he could have been helping them get back to a decent life. And this is something you see all over the world. Policies that take people with addiction problems and punish them, shame them, get catastrophic outcomes. The addiction crisis gets worse. Places that when you have addiction crises say, okay, there's a problem here, and it's certainly a problem, a disastrous problem. How can we practically help these people, both to make the drug use as safe as possible and deal with the underlying factors that are driving the drug use so that they stop engaging in this risky behavior? Those places, they're not magic bullets, right? There's still problems, but they so dramatically reduce the problem. They stop it being an epidemic and a crisis. And that's true of everywhere that has moved beyond these things. So I think there's two key elements of it, right? There's stopping the shame and punishment, which BC has now done. But the second bit is even more important. Stopping the punishment is really important. But the second bit is even more important, right? You've got to then say, okay, but how do we actually help people, right? It's like, if you think about the war on drugs, it's like we're kicking people in the head. You know, just stopping the punishment is like, okay, you've stopped kicking them in the head. That's good. Now help them up, right? That's the crucial bit, the really crucial bit. So I want to talk to you about two last things. I want to talk to you about another discovery that was made about addiction and depression and all sorts of other problems. And I will talk to you about a place that inspired me, that I think we can learn from. So I want to tell you a story about the guy who discovered this. And again, for like 2 minutes, you're going to think, what the hell is he talking about? Well, this story has nothing to do with this subject. Just bear with me, because I don't think you can understand how this incredible breakthrough if you don't understand how it was made. So in the mid-1980s in San Diego, in California, a doctor called Vincent Felitti was approached by Kaiser Permanente, who are one of the big not-for-profit medical providers in California. And they said to him, we've got a problem. We don't know what to do. We need your help. And the problem they had was rising obesity rates. In fact, if you look at the figures compared to today, they were very low. But obesity had been rising and rising for a while, and it was causing all sorts of medical costs. It was making people unwell. So they said to him, nothing we do works. We give people, nutritional advice. We even give them personal trainers. It doesn't seem to be doing much. Can we give you money to just do blue skies research and figure out what would solve this problem? So he said, yeah, okay. And then he's like, oh, geez, now I've got to figure out what to do. So he was trying to think what to do, and he started working with 250 severely obese people who weighed more than 400 pounds and had been dangerously overweight for a long time. And he's working with them. He's thinking, well, what can I do? What can I do? And one day he had an idea that seems, and in fact is, quite stupid. He asked himself, what would happen if really severely obese people literally stopped eating and we gave them vitamin C shots so they didn't get scurvy or whatever? Would they gradually over time reduce their, burn through the body fat in their bodies and get down to a healthier weight? So obviously with a ton of medical supervision, they tried it, they did it. And incredibly, at first, it worked. There's a woman called, I'll call her Susan, that's not her real name, who went down from being more than 400 pounds to 138 pounds. Incredible, right? Her family were phoning up Dr. Felitti saying, you've saved her life, this is incredible. People were thrilled, and there were comparable weight losses throughout the program. I mean, that was one of the biggest, but there were lots like it. And then one day, something happened that no one expected. Susan cracked. She went to KFC or whatever it was and started obsessively eating. And Dr. Felitti called her in. He said, Susan, what happened? What happened? She looked down. She said, I don't know. She was really ashamed. I don't know. He said, well, tell me about the day that you cracked. Did anything in particular happen that day? Something had happened to Susan that day that had never happened to her before. She was in a bar. and a man hit on her, not in a nasty way, quite a nice way. She felt really freaked out, and she went and she started eating. Dr. Felitti was like, oh, what could that mean? And then he asked her a question he'd never asked any of his patients before. He said, Susan, when did you start to put on weight? In her case, it was when she was 11. He said, well, did anything happen to you when you were 11 that didn't happen to you when you were, 9, 14? Anything in particular happened that year? And again, Susan looked down, and she said, well, that's when my grandfather started raping me. Dr. Felitti interviewed everyone in the program. He discovered that 60% of them had made their extreme weight gain in the aftermath of being sexually abused and assaulted. And he was like, what's that about? What's going on there? But Susan explained it to him really well. She said, overweight is overlooked, and that's what I need to be. He realized that this thing that seems so irrational and obviously is unhealthy, being severely obese, was in fact performing a really important function for these women and some of the men, overwhelmingly women, but some of the men. It was protecting them from sexual attention, which they had a very good reason to want to be protected from. Dr. Felitti said he realized it's like there was a fire inside them and he had been focusing on the smoke. But this is a small study, it's 250 people, it seems like such a weird result, that Dr. Felitti went to the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, to get funding for a much bigger study, and this is where it led to a breakthrough in addiction and depression. So, anyone who came to healthcare for an entire year to Kaiser Permanente in San Diego, it doesn't matter what you came in for, headache, schizophrenia, broken leg, anything, was given a questionnaire. The first part said, did any of these bad things happen to you when you were a kid? Things like sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect. And the second part was just going to say, what's your weight? But at the last minute, they added things like, have you ever attempted suicide? Have you been depressed? Do you have an addiction problem? And at first, when they added up the figures, they were like, whoa, there's something wrong here. They added them all up again, and the figures were right. For every category of childhood trauma you experienced, you were 2 to 4 times more likely to be obese, addicted, or depressed. But when you got into the multiple categories, the figures went crazy. If you had experienced 6 categories of childhood trauma, you were 3,100% more likely to have attempted suicide, and you were 4,600% more likely to have an injecting drug problem. And I remember when I first learned this thinking, God, well, at first you think, well, does this study mean that these people are just broken, right? But what they discovered next is even more important. So when the study was over, they suddenly had all these people who'd indicated that they had been physically abused, neglected, sexually abused, all sorts of forms of childhood trauma. So their doctor was told, don't call them in, but next time they come in with a problem, say to them something like, I see that when you were a child, you were sexually abused. I'm so sorry that happened. That should never have happened. You should have been protected. Would you like to talk about it? And 40% of people did not want to talk about it, but 60% of people did, and they wanted to talk about it on average for 5 minutes. And then it was randomly assigned. Some of them were told you can go to a therapist to talk about it more. But what was incredible was just those 5 minutes of an authority figure, a doctor, saying, I'm so sorry, that should never have happened to you. That alone led to a really significant fall in depression and anxiety and suicide attempts. And this fits with a much wider body of evidence. It's not the trauma that screws you up. It's the shame about the trauma. And giving people places to release that shame and trauma and ending a system that imposes more shame and trauma on them is in itself profoundly healing. It also gives us a sense of where we should be spending our money if we want to reduce addiction. You want to spend money on protecting children. Money spent early on protecting children yields dividends in terms of people having better lives, but also huge dividends further down the line in lower manifestations of all sorts of distress. Okay, I want to talk about one last thing. I think you can tell that I learned lots from scientists and doctors all over the world, but I think the people who taught me most were a group of people who were not scientists and doctors, and I want to talk to you a bit about them. So this relates more to depression and anxiety, but also addiction. As you know, we now have absolutely 1 in 3 middle-aged Canadian women is taking a chemical antidepressant at any given time. And there are loads of them who are depressed and not taking antidepressants. We're talking about a staggering level of depression in this society. It's one of the highest levels of depression in the world, in fact. And I thought a bit differently about it after I went to Berlin and met a group of people there. So in the summer of 2011, on a big anonymous housing project in Berlin, a Turkish-German woman called Nuria Cengiz climbed out of her wheelchair and put a sign in her window. And the sign said, "I got a notice saying I'm going to be evicted from my home next Thursday because I can't pay the rent because it keeps going up. So on Wednesday night, I'm going to kill myself." Now, to give you a sense of this project, it's called Coty. It's a big anonymous housing project like ones all over Canada, all over the world. And it was in a poor area called Coty, Kreuzberg, where basically, since the war, because it was kind of ruined, destroyed in the war, there were only 3 groups of people who lived there. There were recent Muslim immigrants, like this woman Nuria, there were gay men, and there were punk squatters. And as you can imagine, these 3 groups didn't get along, but no one really knew anyone, you know. But people walked past Nuria's window, and everyone's rent was going up, and everyone was afraid of being evicted. And everyone knew someone who'd been evicted. So they knocked on Nuria's door. They're like, "Are you okay? Do you need any help?" And she said, "Screw you, I don't want any help, I'm going to kill myself." And she shut the door in their face. But people started talking outside her apartment. And one of them had an idea. There's a big thoroughfare that goes through this housing project into the center of Berlin to Mitte. And one of them said, "You know, on Saturday, if we just block the road, we build a little barricade and we protest, they'll probably let this woman stay in her apartment. There might even be some pressure for our rents to stop going up so much. Why don't we do it?" So Saturday came. The people who lived in Coty, loads of them, blocked the road. Nuria was like, "Oh, I'm going to kill myself. I might as well let them push me into the middle of the street and protest." She wheeled out. The media showed up. They interviewed Nuria. They interviewed people. It got to the end of the day, and the police said, "Okay, you've had your fun. You've done your protest. Take down this barricade. Go home." But the people who lived at Coty said, "Well, hang on. You haven't told Nuria she gets to stay. Actually, we want a rent freeze for our entire housing project. When we've got that, then we'll take our barricade down." But of course they knew the minute they walked away from the barricade, the police would just tear it down. So one of my favorite people in Coty, a woman called Tanya Gartner, she's one of the punk squatters. She wears tiny miniskirts even in Berlin winters. She's hardcore. She had an idea. In her apartment, she had a klaxon, you know those things that make loud noises at soccer matches. She went and got it. She said, "Okay, everyone, here's what we're going to do. We're going to draw up a timetable to man this barricade 24 hours a day until we get a rent freeze for all of us. We're going to sign up, and when you're there, if you're on duty, the police come, let off the klaxon, we'll all come down from our apartments and we'll stop them." So people started signing up to man the barricades, people who had never met and would never have met. So Tanya, in her tiny little miniskirt, if I remember rightly, had the Thursday night shift with Nuria, you know, who's a very religious Muslim in a full hijab, right? And the first few shifts, they were like, "This is so awkward. We've got nothing to talk about. Who could be more different than us?" But as the nights went on, they started talking. Tanya and Nuria discovered they had something incredibly powerful in common. Nuria had come to Berlin when she was 16 years old. She just had twins. She came to Berlin. She was sent from a village in Turkey, and she came to raise enough money to send for her husband back home in Turkey to come and join her. So she worked unbelievably hard. And after a year and a half, when she almost had the money, she got word from home that her husband had died. And sitting there in the cold in Coty with Tanya, she told her something she had never told anyone in Germany before. She'd always told people that her husband died of a heart attack. Actually, he died of tuberculosis, which at that time was seen as like a shameful disease of immigrants, right? That's when Tanya started talking about something she never talked about. She had come to Coty when she was even younger, when she was 15. She got thrown out by her middle-class parents because they hated that she was obsessed with punk. She came to live in a squat in Coty, and not long afterwards, a couple of months later, she got pregnant. Tanya and Nuria realized they had both been children with children of their own in this place they didn't understand. They became great friends. They were always at the front of leading the protests. And these pairings were happening all over Coty. These people were getting to know each other. And directly opposite this housing project, about a year and a half before the protests began, a bit more, a gay club had opened called Südblock, which was run by a man I love called Richard Stein, who, I mean, this is a quite hardcore gay club. To give you a sense of what it's like, the previous place he owned was called Café Anal. I always think you wouldn't want to have a sandwich from Cafe Anal, but and when they opened, this is an area with a lot of very conservative religious Muslims. Their windows got smashed, people were really pissed off. But after the protest began, lots of the Zuidblok, this gay club, the people who worked there, they gave all their furniture to the barricade. And after the protests had been going on for like 4 or 5 months, they said to them, you guys should come and have your meetings in our club, right? We'll give you free food, we'll give you free drinks. And even the kind of lefty types at Coty were like, look, we're not going to persuade these very religious Muslims to come and have meetings underneath these very explicit gay posters. But it did happen. As one of the Turkish-German women there, Neriman Tanker, said to me, we all realized we had to take these small steps to get to understand each other. After the protest had been going on for a year and a half, so loads of the people who live in Coty are construction workers, so they turned the barricade into a nice building with like rooms. After being going for a year and a half, one day a guy turned up at the protest named Tunkai, and he was in his early 50s, and it was clear he'd been living on the streets, and when you meet him, it's obvious he's got some kind of cognitive difficulties, but he's got an amazing energy about him. He started helping out, and after he'd been hanging around for about a week, the people at Coty were like, well, we don't want you to be homeless. You should come and live in this thing we've built. It's quite nice. We'll give you a room. Come and live here. And Tunkai loves hugging people. He's very affectionate. And he became much loved by everyone. And he moved in and became like a key part of the Coty protest. About 9 months after that, the police came to inspect. They would do this every now and then. And Tunkai doesn't like it when people argue. And he thought the police were arguing. So he went to hug the police officer to try to calm him down. And the police officer thought he was being attacked, so he arrested Tunkai. That was when it was discovered. Tunkai had been shut away in a psychiatric hospital, often literally in a padded cell, for 20 years. He'd escaped one day, he'd been on the streets for a couple of months and found his way to Coty. So the police took him back to this psychiatric hospital at the other side of Berlin in Charlottenburg, at which point the entire Coty protest turned into a free Tunkai movement, right? They descended on this psychiatric hospital. And I remember these psychiatrists being like, what the hell is this? We've got this guy we've had locked away for 20 years who no one came to see. And suddenly we've got these women in hijabs, these very camp gay men and these punks demanding his release. But I remember thinking, how many of us, if someone carted us away, would have like 70 people descending, demanding our release? And I remember Uli Hartmann, one of the protesters, saying to them, but the thing is, he doesn't belong with you because you don't love him. He belongs with us. We love him. And they were like, oh, so you want to look after him? And Uli said, no, he looks after us. This isn't like we want to paternalistically take care of him. He's a key part of who we are. Many things happened in Coty. They got Tunkai back. He lives there still. They got a rent freeze for their entire housing project. They then launched a referendum initiative to keep rents down across the whole of Berlin. It got the largest number of written signatures in the history of Germany. As a result, there's now a rent freeze in Berlin. But the last time I saw Nuria, the woman who started all this, she said to me, look, I'm really glad I got to stay in my apartment. That's great. But I gained so much more than that. I was surrounded by these incredible people all along, and I would never have known. And I think about how distressed these people were. Nuria was about to kill herself. Tunkai was shut away in a padded cell. Loads of them were depressed and anxious. They didn't, in the main, need to be pathologized or drugged. They needed to be seen. They needed to be together. They needed to have a sense of meaning. I remember Neriman, the other Turkish German I mentioned just now, said to me one day, when I grew up in Turkey, I grew up in a village, and I called my whole village home. And then I learned that in the Western world, what you're meant to call home is just your 4 walls, and if you're lucky, a few of your family members. But she said, then this protest began, and I started to think of all these people, and this whole place is my home. And she said she realized, in some sense, in our culture, we are homeless. The Bosnian writer Alexander Heyman said, home is where people notice when you're not there. By that standard, how big is the home most of us have, especially during the pandemic, but prior and after, right? And to me, what I learned in Coty was, I remember one time I was sitting with Tanya, the punk squatter outside Zuidblok, the club, and she said to me, When you feel like shit and you're all alone, you think there's something wrong with you. But what we did is we came out of our corner crying and we started to fight. And we realized we were surrounded by people who felt the same way. And to me, that reconnection, I think you can tell I love the people at Cottee, but I have to tell you, they are not exceptional except in one way, which is that they listened to each other's distress, right? They're not unusual. They're not superheroes. They're ordinary people who listened to each other and decided to build a solution. So I think when we think about what we need to do now, we need to say, first of all, the misery that is being experienced in this society is not inevitable. It's not part of nature. It's the result of some mistakes we're making. We can sit alone and tell ourselves there's something wrong with us, or we can do what they did in Cottee. We can come out of our corner crying and start to fight. And we can realize we are surrounded by people who are as hungry for solutions as we are. Thanks very much. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johann, for that incredible presentation. A few things came up for me personally. Number one, it made me think about the fact that one of the largest indicators of resiliency is safe and supportive relationships. Number two, it made me think about the fact that we all have a part to play in contributing to the destigmatization of mental health. And number three, it made me think about the importance of relationships, and that a lot of the stigmatized behaviors in society, at the root of all of them is pain. So let's put our hands together again for Johann. We owe it to ourselves and our future generations to give courage and support to those who are facing adversity now, no matter what their circumstances may be. Let's follow Johann's lead and strive for a better future. Speaking of better futures, I am once again honored to introduce no stranger to addictions and mental health advocacy to close out the 2023 Annual Breakfast. Please join me in welcoming the Mental Health Foundation's President and CEO, Deborah McKinnon.
I can see you're starting to get restless. I promise you, only 8 minutes. We've timed this several times. I need to thank you, Johann, for coming to speak to us today. I know that your research is making a difference for millions around the world. It was one of our donors that first told me, you have to listen to this TED Talk. You need that man to speak at your breakfast. He went on to describe how his son, now in midlife, had grown up with a developmental disability and now struggles with addictions. As a parent, he brought tears to my eyes when he said, that talk changed how I communicate with my son, and it changed our relationship. He went on to say, I wonder how different his life might have been if I had had this kind of information when I was a young parent raising him. Thank you, Johann. Chris, you have to be the most understated man I have ever met. Like, really, we raised some money, he says. I met with Chris and Lisa about 3 weeks ago. I was kind of scared. Chris is a pretty successful guy. He's got lots going on. Lisa is a lady with more poise than I will ever muster. And he said to me, we don't want to be your sponsor. We want to be your partner. What do you need? And then he went out and raised, get this, he says some money, $137,000. If nothing else gets you off your feet this morning, that's it. Thank you so much, Chris. The entire team at Altitude Investments leaned in. They put their business aside and they put mental health and our community first. And because of that, every gift you make today is going to go directly to the cause. I am the daughter of a mother who died from her addictions. We will never know if her heart stopped before her 34th birthday as a result of an accidental drug and alcohol poisoning, or if it were by suicide. What I do know is that it was a result of generations of trauma. It is sheer determination that has led me to this work, sheer determination that history would not repeat itself, that has brought me to stand in front of you today and share these moments. I am convinced that, sadly, if we are willing to look closely through our own family trees, we'll confirm that addictions and mental health affect all of us in some way. Today, we have the chance to change that, to change the future stories to those of community, of compassion, and of healing. For years now, philanthropy and people like you around the world have been supporting physical health causes while we all remained a little too quiet about mental health. We worry about wait time for our ambulances, for surgeries, for beds. But if we really want change, we need to increase investing where so many of these problems actually begin. All I need to do is tell people, even strangers, where I work, and they almost always immediately share a story. I was recently at a counter making a small purchase where I commented to the clerk that I just had one more meeting to go that day. He asked me where I worked. His reaction was immediate. He shared that he struggled with depression and that his family didn't understand, that he couldn't afford counseling, and he thanked me for this work. I hope that someday it means he'll have a better future in mind. Many meetings with potential donors begin as they would in any business. Like all of you, I can see their successes. I can see their accomplishments are obvious. But these conversations almost always end with the family experience of a loved one. Things like, my sister died by suicide. My father had bipolar disorder. My brother spent a lot of time out at Alberta Hospital, Edmonton. As a parent, I did not know where to turn. Generations of pain and trauma, and often excruciating loss. Our role today is not just to raise funds, but to change this. At the Mental Health Foundation, we have a better future in mind. Now more than ever, it is important for us to come together. It is important for us to work as a community to support mental wellness. It's time to shift the way we look at things, and it's time to stop looking away. We need to invest today to prevent these problems from being compounded. With addictions and mental health, the equation is definite. Either pay now or pay much more later. We need to invest early when a problem first occurs and before it becomes expensive. We need to build communities that break down the stigmas associated with mental health and addictions issues and engage in open dialogue about the importance of emotional well-being. We need to design systems that set the stage for prevention. Addictions and mental health aren't problems that we can leave at the feet of our government, our healthcare systems, our emergency departments, our police, our frontline workers, or even our charities to solve. It begins with each one of us. We need to see our role as part of the mental health safety net in this society. We can't keep talking about systems change and alignment of services and philosophical approaches, about recovery models or harm reduction models. We can't keep looking at mental health problems as something that only occur in our inner cities. The problems don't start there, and they will not end there. The lack of safety and real risk begins somewhere else. It begins in our homes, in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our schools, and indeed in our workplaces. We have the power to make the most important changes. Together, we need to get much, much more comfortable with the uncomfortable. We need to remove the shame. and figure out how we can support one another. To be present, to listen, to start conversations, to understand mental illness, to show empathy, and to end the isolation. Hold people's confidences and accept and honor them wherever they are at. What kind of investments? Programs like Kickstand and Access 24/7. So when someone reaches out, we can welcome them, not put them on a wait list. Patient supports through things like the Little Things Fund. It is hard to provide counseling to someone who hasn't eaten today and may not have someplace safe to sleep tonight. Research for programs for things like treatment-resistant depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and so many others. There are new solutions and new research happening every single day. Education and awareness, skill-building workshops, caregiving supports. Caring with someone with mental illness is exhausting, and it's isolating, and people suffer in silence. I keep trying to find the right way to word the next one. Mental health facilities in our province, whether in hospitals, clinics, and emergency rooms, are not designed to promote wellness. There's plenty of knowledge that patient care environment contributes to patient recovery. We need to update our buildings and places where patients and their families stay. We need to create facilities and rooms where the facilities don't fight against the caregivers every single day. Our frontline staff have enough challenges without being challenged by the facilities. We need to upgrade. Let's ignite hope for better days ahead. Let's strive for change. We can do this. Just like in Coddy, we can do this. That you chose to be here today at a fundraising event for mental health says something about who you are. It says volumes about you, about your values, and about your commitment to making a difference. As I close now, our volunteers are handing out pledge cards. Please consider a gift that will create safety, healing, hope, a better future. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for your vision, and thank you for your gift. Just as it takes money, a lot of money, to improve cancer outcomes and cure childhood diseases, new solutions in mental health are going to take significant investment. Your support is invaluable, and with every single donation and contribution, we come closer towards creating an inclusive society that does not reject or marginalize those who are affected by mental health and addictions. Together, we can create a safe space for everyone to talk freely, to seek help, and to receive the resources they need. Take action now. Your contribution matters.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for your leadership and commitment to mental health in our province. Our Mental Health Foundation volunteers will be making their way around the room to collect your donation forms, and we encourage you to give as generously as you are able to. I do also want to mention that there was a phone found in the women's washroom, and it will be at the back AB table. As we wrap up this morning, I want to remind you of the book signing and meet and greet happening in the foyer with our keynote speaker, Johann. We have all 3 of his books available for purchase by donation and the opportunity to meet him and have him sign your book. All proceeds will go directly to support the work of the Mental Health Foundation. Also, on your way out of the room, don't forget to stop by one of the StreetWorks tables to pick up your free naloxone kit and register for one of the virtual training sessions. A friendly reminder that the 50/50 is open until 11:59 p.m. tonight, and the last time I checked, it was at over $11,000. So don't forget to grab your tickets for a chance to win our growing pot. So, who wants to brighten someone else's day? Do you see the beautiful florals on the tables from Lavella? They are so gorgeous, and one lucky person at each table can grab their arrangement and pay it forward to someone in your life to brighten their day. A friend, a coworker, a family member. Help us spread some joy today. So one of you has a sticker of a star on the back of your program. So take a peek, and if you have a star sticker on the back of your program, you get to take the flowers home and pay it forward today. I see a lot of happy people. So thank you to the staff at ECC for a delicious breakfast and wonderful service throughout the event. Thank you to our audio and visual production company, Cine, for helping us ensure the sound, lighting, and virtual experience was seamless. I know we all want to get out of here soon. Thank you to our event management team, Be Together, for their expertise and attention to detail. And a very special thank you to all of the volunteers who helped bring this event together. We are so grateful. Let's give a round of applause for them. And thank you again to each and every one of you for your support of this event and the work of the Mental Health Foundation. A heartfelt thanks to our presenting sponsor, Altitude Investments Groups of Company, for their incredible support. And we have a brief video to show with you, showing just how much the support of everyone here, in person and virtually, means to us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We couldn't do it without you.
It wasn't a little thing, those donations and the money and stuff, it saved lives.
Thank you so much to everyone who gave their time and their hard-earned income to Kickstand and for helping us grow.
A sincere and heartfelt thank you. You are making a difference every day in the lives of so many across our province.
Thank you so much for your donation. You helped me get through a time in my life where I didn't have the tools to make it through on my own. And your generosity and caring is part of why I'm still here. So thank you.
It's because of you that we're able to really change the system and help young people get the support that they need when they need it.
I want to thank all of you for your generous contributions and supporting us to help Alberta's young people have more good days.
Thank you.
Thank you.